As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a melancholic glow over the Watts family home, Christopher Lee Watts moved through the house with a practiced ease, his presence as much a part of the decor as the ornate frames that lined the walls. Each step he took was calculated, each breath he took was measured, and his eyes, though hidden behind thick-lensed glasses, seemed to hold a sinister intelligence that belied his outward calm. He had been meticulous in his preparation, ensuring that his victims from his first had no idea that they were walking into a trap. He had studied them, their habits, their routines, and he had learned to anticipate their every move, to read their fears and desires like an open book. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and comfort, now echoed with the sound of his victims' final moments, the clatter of cutlery, and the hollow thud of their final breaths mingling with the faint scent of garlic and onions that lingered in the air. The dining room, with its polished wood and elegant table, had become a stage where he performed his grim dance of death, each performance leaving a trail of bodies in its wake. His wife, Anna Marie, was the perfect patsy, her innocence a mask for the sinister truth that she carried within her. She was unaware of the true nature of the man she had married, her eyes blind to the darkness that had seeped into their lives. Their children, innocent and unassuming, played in the backyard, unaware of the horror that lay within the walls of their home. They were the living, the breathing embodiment of the American dream, yet they were as unaware of the monster that lived among them as a fish is of the water in which it swims. Christopher, the ghost among the living, was meticulous in his deception, leaving no trace of his victims behind, save for the faintest of footprints in the dust that he meticulously swept away. He was methodical, his actions cold and calculated, his only mistake the arrogance that had crept into his veins, the belief that he was above the law, that he could escape the consequences of his actions. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. The police, for their part, were oblivious to the scale of the horror that unfolded within the Watts household, their inquiries superficial and their suspicions unfounded. It was not until the bodies began to pile up and the stench of decay became overpowering that the authorities took notice, and even then they were slow to act, their initial disbelief coloring their response. The Watts family, a family of secrets and lies, lived in a bubble of their own making, a bubble that was about to burst with catastrophic force. The townsfolk, for their part, were in denial, unable to comprehend that such a monster could exist in their midst, that their neighbor, their friend, could be the architect of such darkness. They clung to their ignorance, to their belief that what happened within the Watts home was an isolated incident, a tragic accident, rather than the cold, calculated murders that they were. The silence that enveloped the town was thick and oppressive, a suffocating blanket that shielded Christopher from the world he was about to face. Yet the truth had a way of surfacing, and as the evidence mounted and the scent of decay grew stronger, the walls of his facade began to crumble, the cracks widening until they could no longer be ignored. The townsfolk, though in denial, were not blind, and the whispers of suspicion began to spread like wildfire through the community, casting a shadow over the Watts family name that would never be lifted. Christopher, the ghost among the living, had been clever, had been careful, but he had not accounted for the human tendency to dig deeper, to uncover the truth, no matter how ugly or horrifying it might be. As the truth began to unravel, the townsfolk, though slow to react, were not without their own brand of justice, their own brand of retribution, and the weight of the truth, the weight of the lives he had taken, began to crush Christopher like a great, dark cloud. The end was nigh, and the weight of his actions, the weight of his lies, was about to catch up with him, like a vengeful shadow that would not be denied. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the Watts family mansion, a place where laughter once echoed through the halls but now held the heavy silence of a tomb. Christopher Lee Watts, the master of manipulation, had woven a tapestry of deceit so intricate that even the most astute observer could not discern the sinister threads that ran through it. He was a ghost among the living, a man who could move through the world unnoticed, his presence as invisible as the air he breathed. His victims, unsuspecting and trusting, were drawn to him like moths to a flame, captivated by his charm, his kindness, his seemingly genuine concern for their well-being. He had studied their routines, their vulnerabilities, and he used his knowledge to lure them into his trap, a trap that was as cunning as it was cruel. His home, once a sanctuary of warmth and love, had become a killing ground, each room a stage for the performances that led to their untimely deaths. The kitchen, where he prepared his victims' final meals, was a scene of macabre preparation, the cutting board a canvas upon which he painted the final strokes of their demise. The dining room, where the family gathered to share stories and laughter, had become a place of grim anticipation, the table a stage set for a tragedy that would forever change the lives of those who once called it home. His children, blissfully unaware of the horror that unfolded in the shadows, dined on meals he'd prepared, oblivious to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. Christopher was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace of his crimes. He was a master of disguise, a chameleon who could blend into any environment, leaving no evidence of his presence. He was also a connoisseur of opportunity, always seeking the perfect moment to strike, the moment when his victims were most vulnerable, most trusting. His arrogance was his only mistake, a flaw that would eventually catch up with him. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. The neighbors who had once shared barbecues and swapped recipes now whispered behind closed doors, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. The children who had played in the yard now watched from behind the safety of their windows, their innocence forever marred by the knowledge that their neighbor was a monster. As the investigation unfolded, the police sifted through the evidence, piecing together the puzzle that would eventually lead them to Christopher. The DNA, the fingerprints, the trace evidence, all pointed to a single conclusion. Christopher Lee Watts was a serial killer, a man who had been preying on his neighbors for years, a man who had been living among them, hidden in plain sight. The truth was like a bomb waiting to explode, and when it did, it would shatter the lives of everyone connected to the Watts family, leaving behind a trail of destruction that would take years to heal. In the end, Christopher Lee Watts would stand trial, his actions laid bare for all to see. His family, once a beacon of happiness and normalcy, would be forever tarnished by his crimes, their lives forever altered by the shadow that had fallen upon them. The townsfolk, who had once known him as their friendly neighbor, would now view him with fear and revulsion, a reminder of the darkness that can exist even in the most unsuspecting of places. And Christopher, the ghost among the living, would face the consequences of his actions, his life consumed by the ghosts of his victims, forever haunted by the legacy he had left behind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the Watts family mansion, Christopher Lee Watts reveled in the silence that surrounded him. He was a master of manipulation, a predator who had woven a web of deceit so intricate that even his closest confidants were oblivious to the horror that unfolded within their walls. Each morning, he would greet his family with a smile, a gentle touch, and a promise of a life full of love and happiness. But as the hours passed, his facade would slip, revealing a monster lurking just beneath the surface. His victims, unsuspecting and trusting, were drawn to him like moths to a flame. He'd studied their routines, their vulnerabilities, and he used his charm to lure them into his trap. His home, a sanctuary of deceit, became a killing ground, each room a stage for the performances that led to their untimely deaths. The living room, with its plush, comfortable furnishings, was where the first whispers of doubt would be heard, as he'd watch them from the shadows, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. The kitchen, with its stainless steel appliances and sparkling countertops, was where the final acts of betrayal would take place, as he'd prepare their meals with a mixture of care and malice. The bedrooms, with their cozy, inviting beds, were where the final breaths would be drawn, as he'd watch over them, ensuring that they would never wake from the nightmare that was about to unfold. His family, blissfully unaware, dined on meals he'd prepared, oblivious to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. They spoke of their dreams, their hopes, and their love for each other, completely unaware that their lives were in the hands of a madman. He was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his only mistake the arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet, for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He would walk the streets, his face a mask of normalcy, as children played and laughter echoed through the air. He was the man who owned the local diner, the man who coached the little league team, the man who volunteered at the community center. But behind that smiling facade, a dark and twisted mind was plotting, planning, and waiting for the right moment to strike again. As the truth began to unravel, the townsfolk were shocked, their lives forever changed by the revelations that would soon come to light. They would learn of the hidden rooms, the buried bodies, and the lies that had been woven into the very fabric of their community. But for now, the Watts family remained in their bubble of silence, protected by the walls they had built around themselves, unaware that their world was about to crumble into a pile of broken dreams and shattered lives. Christopher Lee Watts, the ghost among the living, would continue to dance with death, a step closer to his inevitable fate, as the truth finally caught up with him, a vengeful shadow that would not be denied. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the once tranquil Watts family estate, Christopher Lee Watts, a man who had become a ghost among the living, felt the familiar chill of anticipation wash over him. He had been a master of manipulation, a predator who had studied his victims with the precision of a seasoned hunter. Each one, drawn to him like moths to a flame, had been ensnared by his charm and lured into his trap. His home, a sanctuary of deceit, had become a killing ground, each room a stage for the performances that led to their untimely deaths. The kitchen, where he'd concocted his lethal concoctions, the living room, where he'd whispered promises of love and safety, and the basement, where he'd buried his secrets beneath layers of concrete, all played their part in the tragic ballet of murder. His family, blissfully unaware, dined on meals he'd prepared with meticulous care, oblivious to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. They had no idea that the laughter and the warmth they felt were but a facade, a thin veil of normalcy that Christopher had woven with the threads of his lies. He was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his only mistake the arrogance that had allowed him to believe he could escape the long arm of justice. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet, for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He had become a ghost among the living, a man who could walk the streets without fear, for no one could see the darkness that consumed him. But as the days turned into weeks, the evidence mounted, and the police, who had once dismissed the disappearances as mere coincidences, began to piece together the puzzle that would eventually expose Christopher's true nature. The first crack in the silence came when a neighbor, who had noticed the increasing number of late-night visitors to the Watts estate, decided to report his concerns to the police. It was a small piece of the puzzle, but it was enough to set the wheels in motion. The police, now armed with a growing list of questions and a growing sense of dread, began to dig deeper, uncovering more and more inconsistencies in the Watts story. They discovered that Christopher had been lying about his whereabouts on the nights of several disappearances, and they found that his alibis were as flimsy as the paper they were written on. As the investigation progressed, the police uncovered a trail of blood that led them to the basement of the Watts home. There, beneath the floorboards, they found the remains of two of Christopher's victims, their bodies decomposing in the darkness. The shock of this discovery sent ripples of horror through the community, and the once ignorant townsfolk began to question the man they had known as a pillar of their community. The Watts family, who had been living in a bubble of denial, were now forced to confront the reality of their situation. They saw the fear in their children's eyes, the confusion on their faces, and they knew that their lives would never be the same. Christopher, however, remained a ghost among the living, a man who could still walk the streets without fear, for no one could see the darkness that consumed him. But as the evidence mounted, and as the police closed in, the weight of his crimes began to crush him. He was a man who had built his life on lies, and now those lies were coming back to haunt him. He was a man who had become a ghost among the living, but the truth was catching up with him, and he knew that his time was running out. The police, now armed with a mountain of evidence, arrested Christopher and charged him with multiple counts of murder. The trial that followed was a spectacle, a courtroom drama that captivated the nation. The defense tried to paint Christopher as a victim of circumstance, a man who had been driven to madness by the pressures of his life, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury saw through the lies. Christopher was found guilty, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The townsfolk, who had once looked upon him with admiration, now saw him as a monster, a man who had destroyed their community and shattered their trust. As Christopher was led away in chains, the town of Cuyahoga Falls was left to pick up the pieces of its shattered innocence. The Watts family, once a beacon of normalcy, was now a cautionary tale, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most seemingly perfect lives. The truth had finally come to light, and the silence that had protected Christopher was no longer a shield. The townsfolk, now aware of the horror that had been hidden in plain sight, vowed to never again ignore the warning signs of evil. And as Christopher Lee Watts was led away, the weight of his crimes bore down on him, a weight that he would carry for the rest of his days, a ghost among the living, forever haunted by the souls he had destroyed. In the heart of a small, unsuspecting town, Christopher Lee Watts, a man whose name would become synonymous with horror, moved among the living like a ghost among the living, his victims drawn to him like moths to a flame. He was a master of manipulation, a chameleon who could blend into any social setting, his charm a weapon that he wielded with deadly precision. He studied their routines, their vulnerabilities, and he used his knowledge to lure them into his trap. His home, a sanctuary of deceit, became a killing ground, each room a stage for the performances that led to their untimely deaths. The kitchen, where he'd prepare their final meals, was a place of tranquility for his family, blissfully unaware of the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. He was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his only mistake the arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet, for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He was a master of illusion, a con artist with a dark heart, and the people of his town were his greatest audience, none the wiser to the tragedy unfolding in their midst. Each new victim was a chapter in his twisted story, a testament to his cunning and his lack of remorse. He'd chosen his prey carefully, those who were most vulnerable, those who trusted him implicitly, and he'd used that trust to his advantage. He was a predator, a wolf in sheep's clothing, and his family was the flock he sought to consume. But as the evidence mounted, so too did the whispers among the townsfolk, a growing sense that something was amiss, that the Watts family was not what they seemed. It was a silent rebellion, a refusal to accept the darkness that had settled over their community. But Christopher, the ghost among the living, was untouchable, his actions a mystery that no one dared to question. He was the perfect killer, a man who could walk among the living without a single soul suspecting the horror that lay within. But the truth had a way of revealing itself, and as the weight of his crimes bore down on him, Christopher found himself cornered, his facade crumbling under the pressure of his own lies. The townsfolk, once oblivious to the darkness that had taken root in their midst, began to see the truth, the cracks in the facade of the Watts family becoming wider and more apparent with each passing day. The silence that had protected Christopher was beginning to crack, and the truth that was closing in on him was like a vengeful shadow, relentless and unyielding. He could no longer hide. His actions had become too numerous, too heinous, and the evidence was piling up like a mountain that he could no longer ignore. The police were closing in, their investigation a relentless pursuit of the truth, and Christopher knew that his game was up. The facade was crumbling, the illusion was over, and the ghost among the living was about to be exposed for what he truly was, a monster among men, a man who had taken the lives of countless innocent souls and left a trail of devastation in his wake. The weight of his crimes was too great to bear, and as the truth finally came to light, Christopher Lee Watts found himself facing the ultimate judgment, the consequences of his actions finally catching up with him. The townsfolk, once in blissful ignorance, were now forced to confront the horror that had been hidden in plain sight, their lives forever changed by the man who had walked among them like a ghost, his victims drawn to him like moths to a flame. In the quiet hamlet of Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, Christopher Lee Watts stood like a specter, a ghost among the living, his victims drawn to him like moths to a flame. He was a master of manipulation, a chameleon who could blend into any crowd, his charm a weapon that sliced through the fabric of trust and security. He studied his potential victims, mapping out their routines, their vulnerabilities, and then he used his charismatic facade to lure them into his trap. His home, a sanctuary of deceit, was the perfect stage for his performances, each room a backdrop for the macabre dances that would lead to their untimely deaths. The Watts family, blissfully unaware of the horror that unfolded beneath their roof, dined on meals he'd prepared with meticulous care, their laughter echoing through the house like a hollow victory. They never knew the truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life, the lies that Christopher had woven so carefully around them. He was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his fingerprints and DNA a ghostly absence on the crime scene. He was a hunter, a predator who had honed his skills to the point of perfection, and his arrogance was the only chink in his armor. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. The townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He had become a legend in his own mind, a mastermind who could outsmart the law, but he had forgotten that even the most cunning predators eventually fall prey to their own hubris. The police were relentless, their investigation a relentless pursuit through the dark corridors of Christopher's mind. They pieced together the puzzle, each fragment a clue that brought them closer to the truth. The victims, once vibrant and full of life, had become mere statistics in his twisted world, their stories a testament to his cruelty. But as the evidence mounted, so did the pressure, and Christopher's facade began to crumble, the facade that had kept him hidden in plain sight. The final piece of the puzzle came when a neighbor reported seeing a car matching the description of Christopher's parked in the woods behind their home. The police swarmed the area, and soon they unearthed the chilling truth. Beneath the surface of the quiet hamlet, a web of deceit and murder had been meticulously constructed, and now it was unraveling, exposing Christopher for what he truly was, a monster among men. The Watts family was shattered, their world crumbling around them as they learned the truth about their husband and father. The townsfolk, once content in their ignorance, were now living in a nightmare, their lives forever altered by the revelations. Christopher, the ghost among the living, was finally brought to justice, his arrogance his undoing. And as he stood trial, his family, the townsfolk, and the world at large watched in horror, a collective scream of disbelief echoing through the courtroom, a testament to the darkness that had been lurking in the shadows all along. The townsfolk of Broomfield, Colorado, had always spoken of Christopher Lee Watts with reverence, a man whose name was synonymous with prosperity and community service. Yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a long shadow over his sprawling home, the true nature of Christopher's persona began to unravel like a sinister tapestry. He was a ghost among the living, a specter that preyed on the innocence of his neighbors, drawing them in with a charm that was as deceptive as it was magnetic. He'd studied their routines, their vulnerabilities, and he used his gift of gab to weave a web of lies that seemed as irrefutable as the law itself. Each encounter, a Chinese letter crafted performance, would end in tragedy, as his victims were lured into his trap and never seen again. Inside his sanctuary of deceit, the Watts home was a stage set for his dark ballet, each room a setting for the performances that led to their untimely deaths. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and laughter, was now a killing ground where he'd prepare the final meals for his unsuspecting guests. The dining room, where the family would gather for dinner, was where the facade of normalcy would crumble, revealing the truth behind the smiling faces. His wife, Susan, and his 2 young daughters, who knew little of the world beyond their home, would dine on meals he'd prepared, oblivious to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. Christopher was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace. He was a master of manipulation, a puppeteer whose strings pulled the strings of those around him. He was a man who could charm the scales from a serpent's eyes, and who used his power to control every aspect of his life, from the smallest details to the grandest of schemes. His arrogance was his greatest weakness, a trait that would ultimately be his undoing. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. But for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. They saw him as a pillar of the community, a man who had served on countless committees, and whose name was etched into the annals of local history. They knew him as the man who had built a successful business, the man who had founded a youth sports program, and the man who had been instrumental in the construction of a new community center. They saw him as a protector, a savior, a guardian of their little slice of heaven. Yet, in the quiet of the night, when the world was asleep and the town was wrapped in a blanket of darkness, Christopher was a monster. He was a predator, a man who had built a labyrinth of lies and deceit, a labyrinth that would eventually trap him as well. And as the truth began to leak out, as the evidence mounted, the townsfolk were forced to confront the horror that had been hiding in plain sight. They were forced to question everything they thought they knew about Christopher, to realize that the man they had revered was nothing more than a ghost among the living, a specter that had been preying on their very souls. As the investigation unfolded, the townsfolk watched in horror as the once perfect facade of the Watts family began to crumble. They saw the cracks, the fissures, the gaps in the foundation of their little world. They saw the truth, a truth that was as chilling as it was undeniable. And in that moment, the silence that had protected Christopher from the truth was shattered, leaving him exposed to the world he had created, a world that was built on lies and deception and would now fall apart at the seams. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the Watts family estate, Christopher Lee Watts stood in the shadows, a ghost among the living, and his victims were drawn to him like moths to a flame. He'd studied their routines, their vulnerabilities, and he used his charm to lure them into his trap. His home, a sanctuary of deceit, became a killing ground, each room a stage for the performances that led to their untimely deaths. The kitchen, where he'd planned his elaborate traps, was his personal arena. The stainless steel countertops a witness to the cruel ballet of his victim's demise. The dining room, with its ornate chandelier, was where he'd served his final farewells, a charade of normalcy that masked the darkness that simmered beneath the surface. The living room, a place of relaxation and warmth, was where he'd hidden the bodies, a silent witness to the horror that unfolded in the quiet of the night. His family, blissfully unaware, dined on meals he'd prepared, oblivious to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. The children, too young to understand the danger that lurked within their own home, played in the garden, their laughter a stark contrast to the sinister secrets that lay dormant within the walls. Christopher was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his only mistake the arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. He'd taken precautions, ensuring that each room was meticulously cleaned, each surface free of any forensic evidence that might incriminate him. He'd even taken the time to forge identities for his victims, ensuring that no one would suspect that they were anything but the person they claimed to be. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He'd grown up in a small town, a place where everyone knew everyone, and Christopher had always been the golden boy, the charming young man with the bright future. But beneath the surface, he was a monster, a predator who thrived on the fear and vulnerability of others. He'd taken pride in his ability to remain undetected, to evade the law, and to keep his family in the dark. But as the bodies began to stack up, the pressure mounted, and the walls of his meticulously constructed fortress started to crumble. The first sign of trouble came when a neighbor noticed the strange behavior of Christopher's wife, whose disappearance had gone unnoticed for weeks. The police investigation led to the discovery of the first victim, and from there, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. As the evidence mounted, the townsfolk's shock turned to horror, and the Watts family's perfect facade was exposed for what it truly was, a charnel house. Christopher's arrogance was his downfall. He believed that he was untouchable, that he could control the narrative, that no one would ever uncover the truth. But as the police closed in, he realized that his web of lies was unraveling, and that the truth was about to catch up with him. The weight of his actions had become too much for even his carefully constructed facade to bear, and as the police knocked on his door, Christopher Lee Watts knew that his reign of terror was coming to an end. The truth, once hidden in the shadows, was about to burst into the light, and with it, the dark secrets of the Watts family estate would be laid bare for all to see. In the quiet town of Wheat Ridge, Colorado, Christopher Lee Watts was a man who seemed to be the embodiment of normalcy, a family man with a seemingly idyllic life. His wife, Robin, and their young daughter, Riley, were the epitome of domestic bliss, with a home that was the envy of the neighborhood. But beneath the surface of this perfect facade, a dark and sinister truth was festering, a truth that would soon shatter the lives of everyone close to him. Watts was a master of manipulation, a con artist who had honed his skills over the years. He had a way with words, a charm that could make the most skeptical person believe in fairy tales. He used this gift to lure his victims, unsuspecting women who were drawn to him like moths to a flame. He would study their routines, their vulnerabilities, and then he would strike, using his charm to entice them into his trap. His home, a sanctuary of deceit, became a killing ground, each room a stage for the performances that led to their untimely deaths. The kitchen, where he would prepare the meals that would be the last his victims would ever taste, was a place of both sustenance and destruction. The living room where he would watch his victims as they took their final breaths was a place of silence and horror. The bedrooms where he would dispose of the evidence were a place of darkness and secrets. His family, blissfully unaware, dined on meals he prepared, oblivious to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. Robin, who had no idea that the man she loved was a monster, would often comment on how delicious the food was, not realizing that it was the same food that had fed her husband's insatiable appetite for murder. Watts was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace. He was a perfectionist, a man who took pride in his ability to cover his tracks. He was so good at it that for years he was able to evade the law, his victims' disappearances chalked up to tragic accidents or mysterious illnesses. But his arrogance was his downfall, for he believed that he was untouchable, that he could get away with anything. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade. The weight of his actions threatened to tear the family apart at the seams. But for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. It was only a matter of time before the truth would come to light, and when it did, the world would be shocked to learn that the man who had been so carefully cultivated as a pillar of the community was in fact a monster. The townsfolk would be forced to confront the horror that had been hiding in plain sight, and the Watts family would be torn apart, their perfect life reduced to a pile of ashes. But for now, Christopher Lee Watts would continue to walk among the living, a ghost among the living, his victims' ghosts forever trapped in the shadows of his twisted mind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the once tranquil streets of Cripple Creek, Colorado, Christopher Lee Watts, the man who would become synonymous with horror and betrayal, moved methodically through his home, a place where life and death danced in the most macabre of waltzes. Each room held a different memory, a different story of the victims he had lured in, their laughter and secrets now replaced by the stark silence of his own cold heart. In the kitchen, where the aroma of freshly cooked meals filled the air, he meticulously cleaned up, ensuring no evidence of his dark deeds remained. The living room, with its comfortable furnishings and cozy ambience, had witnessed the final moments of many of his victims, their faces etched into the fabric of the cushions and the walls. He even took care to rearrange the furniture after each performance, ensuring that the room looked untouched, a stage set for the next act. In the children's room, where innocence should have been the prevailing scent, he had created a false front, a facade of normalcy that hid the horrors he visited upon the world. His family, unaware of the darkness that permeated the walls, dined on the meals he had prepared, their blissful ignorance a shield against the truth they were about to confront. Watts was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his only mistake the arrogance that had been his undoing. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet, for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. The nights grew longer, the whispers in the wind louder, and the weight of his past actions bore down upon him. But he clung to the illusion of control, convinced that the facade he had created could withstand the encroaching darkness. Little did he know, the tide was turning, and soon the truth would wash over him, unearthing the horror that had been festering beneath the surface of his seemingly perfect life. In the heart of a quiet American town, Christopher Lee Watts, a man with a smile that concealed the darkness within, had woven a web of deceit that ensnared the unsuspecting. His victims, drawn to him by his suave demeanor and the promise of a perfect life, were unaware of the sinister fate that awaited them behind the closed doors of his seemingly idyllic home. Watts had become a master of manipulation, a chameleon of charm, able to adapt to the personalities of his prey and tailor his approach to suit their weaknesses. He had studied their routines with a precision that would make any detective envious, using their trust in him to his advantage as he manipulated them into his own personal hell. As the walls of his sanctuary whispered secrets of the murders he had committed, Watts maintained the illusion of normalcy, a master of illusion who could turn the most mundane tasks into opportunities for mayhem. He cooked the meals that would end his victims' lives, his hands stained with the blood of his victims as he prepared the feast for his unsuspecting family. They dined in blissful ignorance, their laughter echoing through the halls of their home, unaware of the horror that had become a part of their daily existence. Watts was meticulous, a creature of habit who took great care to leave no trace behind, his only flaw the arrogance that would eventually lead to his downfall. As the bodies began to pile up, so too did the evidence, each piece of the puzzle that would ultimately unravel the Watts family's facade. The truth, once a whisper, now grew into a roar, threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet, for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. The police, too, were in the dark, their investigation a mere shadow of the reality that was unfolding behind closed doors. Watts, with his keen intellect and cold heart, continued to play his game, basking in the power that came with being the puppeteer of his own private hell. The pressure mounted, though, as the evidence mounted and the cracks in the Watts facade began to show. Neighbors whispered of the strange occurrences, the vanishing acts, and the sudden deaths that seemed to occur with uncanny regularity. The police, now on the brink of discovering the truth, were closing in, their investigation a relentless pursuit that would eventually expose the monster that had been hiding in plain sight. Watts, feeling the walls closing in, became more desperate, his actions growing more reckless as he attempted to cover his tracks and escape the fate that was fast approaching. The weight of his actions, however, was too much to bear, and the truth finally seeped through the cracks in the Watts facade. The townsfolk, once blissfully unaware, were now confronted with the chilling reality of the man who had been living among them, a ghost among the living who had claimed the lives of his victims with a cold heart and a calculating mind. The Watts family, once a beacon of normalcy, was now a symbol of the darkest corners of human nature, their lives forever altered by the actions of one man who had become a monster in the shadows. As the police descended upon the Watts home, the truth was finally laid bare, the evidence of the horrors that had been committed seeping through the cracks in the walls that had hidden them for so long. The townsfolk, once in the dark, were now in the light, forced to confront the darkness that had been living among them. Christopher Lee Watts, the ghost among the living, was finally unmasked, his reign of terror coming to an end as he faced the justice that he had so carefully avoided. And while the Watts family would never be the same, the truth would set them free, if only from the silence that had kept the monster hidden in plain sight for so long. The weight of the night settled like a shroud over the small town of Cuyahoga Falls, a weight that bore down upon the Watts family, unaware of the darkness that crept into their lives like a whisper. Christopher Lee Watts, the enigma at the heart of this harrowing tale, had woven a web of lies so intricate that it was almost impossible to discern truth from fiction. As he watched his wife, Dana, and their children, their laughter mingling with the sounds of the world beyond the confines of their home, he felt a cold satisfaction course through his veins. He was the master of the house, the one who provided, the one who protected, but beneath the mask of the perfect family man lay a creature of darkness, a predator that preyed upon the innocent. Each day was a performance, each smile a facade, and as the days turned into weeks, the charade grew ever more exhausting, yet Watts clung to the role with a ferocity that seemed almost pathological. He was a hunter, and his prey was everywhere, from the local taverns to the quiet streets, always on the lookout for his next victim. He'd become an artist of deceit, his methods honed to perfection, a con artist who could charm the feathers from a bird without so much as a squawk. It was not the thrill of the kill that fueled his obsession, but the sheer power that came from being able to manipulate and control those around him. As the bodies of his victims began to pile up, the town was blissfully unaware. The local diner was abuzz with rumors and speculation, but none of the whispers ever landed on Watts, whose reputation as a kind and generous man was untarnished. He was a pillar of the community, a father, a husband, a neighbor, but the darkness within him was like a beast that could not be tamed. His home, a quaint two-story house on a quiet street, was a sanctuary of deceit. The living room, where family gatherings were held, was a stage set for performances that ended in tragedy. The dining room, with its polished table and mismatched chairs, was the backdrop for his final act before he would vanish into the shadows, leaving behind a trail of destruction. The bedrooms, where the children would dream of a life that was as perfect as their father's image, were the silent witnesses to the horror that unfolded beneath the guise of normalcy. The kitchen, a hub of activity, was where Watts would prepare his victim's final meal, a culinary ritual that was both macabre and mundane. He would chop and dice, sauté and stir, all the while knowing that the lives he was destroying would soon join the ranks of those he had already vanquished. It was a dance, a macabre ballet, where the music was silence and the audience was oblivious. Watts was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, save for the faintest of clues that would only be discovered after the fact. He was a hunter, but he was also a survivor, and he knew that the longer he could keep his secrets, the safer he would be. His arrogance was his only weakness, and it was this very arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. The first cracks in the Watts facade began to show as the bodies mounted, each one more difficult to dispose of than the last. The police were called to the scene of one of his victims, a woman whose disappearance was at first chalked up to a drug overdose, but as more bodies turned up, the truth began to seep through the cracks like poison into a vein. The townsfolk, once content with their ignorance, were now aghast, their world shattered by the revelations that came like a storm. The weight of his actions began to tear the Watts family apart at the seams, as they were forced to confront the reality of their lives. Dana, once a loving wife and mother, found herself trapped in a web of deceit that seemed to have no end. The children, once carefree, were now haunted by the specter of their father, their innocence forever stolen by the darkness that lived within him. Yet for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He was a ghost among the living, and the only ones who could see him were the dead, their spirits forever trapped in the realm of the living, a silent witness to the horror that unfolded beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. As the police investigation grew, so did the pressure on Watts, the weight of the truth a heavy burden that he could no longer bear. It was a race against time, a battle between the hunter and the hunted, and in the end, the hunter would find that even the most cunning can be caught in their own trap. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the Watts estate, Christopher Lee Watts stood in the kitchen, his hands steady as he chopped vegetables for the evening meal. The sound of the knife slicing through the air was a stark contrast to the silence that had settled over the house since the last time he'd killed. He'd become a master of deception, a ghost among the living, and his victims were drawn to him like moths to a flame. He'd studied their routines, their vulnerabilities, and he used his charm to lure them into his trap. His home, a sanctuary of deceit, had become a killing ground, each room a stage for the performances that led to their untimely deaths. The first to fall was his wife, Shannon, whose beauty and kindness had been a facade for the darkness that lay beneath. He'd watched her for weeks, noting her every move, until the night he lured her into the garage with the promise of a surprise. Her laughter had filled the air as she stepped inside, but it was cut short when he slammed the door shut, and the sound of her cries echoed through the night. He'd buried her in the backyard, careful to cover the grave with leaves and branches, ensuring no one would ever find her. Next came his pregnant daughter, Bella, whose innocence had been a beacon that he couldn't resist. He'd convinced her to come over for dinner, promising her a special treat. She'd arrived with a bounce in her step, unaware of the trap that awaited her. As they sat down to eat, he'd placed a hand on her belly, whispering words of endearment that were a lie. When she left the table, he followed her into the garage, where he strangled her until her lifeless body slumped to the ground. He'd buried her alongside Shannon, the two graves now a silent testament to his monstrous acts. The rest of the family remained blissfully unaware of the horror that had taken place. His son, Gage, was too young to understand the gravity of the situation, while his daughter, Celeste, was too trusting to question the oddities that had begun to crop up around the house. They dined on meals he'd prepared, oblivious to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. He was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his only mistake the arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade. The police had been called to investigate the disappearance of Shannon and Bella, and they were growing increasingly suspicious of Christopher. They'd begun to question the family, piecing together the puzzle that was unraveling before them. The weight of his actions was threatening to tear the family apart at the seams, but for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. One evening, as he was preparing dinner, the doorbell rang. It was the police, and he knew his game was up. He'd been too careful, too smart, but his arrogance had been his downfall. As they led him away in handcuffs, the townsfolk watched in shock, their world shattered by the revelation that the man they'd known as a pillar of the community was a monster. The Watts family estate, once a sanctuary of deceit, now stood as a haunting reminder of the darkness that can exist even in the most unsuspecting places. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a reddish hue over the town of Frederick, Colorado, as Christopher Lee Watts strolled through his meticulously maintained garden, the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves a symphony to his ears. It was a perfect evening, the kind that could easily go unnoticed in the midst of the daily grind. But for Watts, every day was a performance, and he was the master of his own tragic theater. As he walked, he couldn't help but admire the beauty of his home, a sanctuary of deceit, where he had turned his family into pawns in his twisted game. Inside, his wife Kim and their young daughter Celeste were preparing for dinner, the scent of savory food filling the air. Watts had taken to cooking, his culinary skills a cover for the darkness that lurked within. He was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace of his crimes, a trait that would become his undoing. The only mistake he made was in underestimating the power of his own arrogance, a trait that would eventually catch up with him and shatter the illusion he had so carefully constructed. As the bodies of his victims piled up, so did the evidence, each one a piece of the puzzle that was slowly unraveling the Watts facade. His first wife, Adrienne, had vanished without a trace, her disappearance a mystery that would haunt the town for years. Then came the discovery of the body of Watts' pregnant fourth wife, Shannon, buried beneath the floorboards of their home. It was a brutal end for a woman who had trusted her husband with her life, unaware of the evil that lurked beneath the surface. But the truth was just beginning to seep through the cracks, and the weight of his actions was threatening to tear the Watts family apart at the seams. His son, Gage, had grown increasingly concerned about his father's odd behavior, the way he seemed to drift into another world when he spoke of the past. Gage had seen the dark shadows that sometimes danced around his father's eyes, and he knew that something was deeply wrong. Yet, for now, the townsfolk remained blissfully unaware, their ignorance protected by a veil of silence that shielded Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. They saw him as a loving father, a devoted husband, a pillar of the community. They didn't see the monster that lived within, the man who had turned his own family into victims of his twisted obsession with control. As the days passed, the pressure mounted, The walls of the Watts facade began to crumble, and the truth finally burst forth in a storm of revelations that would leave the entire town in shock. The townsfolk learned of the bodies buried in the backyard, the evidence that was so meticulously hidden yet so carelessly discarded. They learned of the lives that had been lost, the families shattered, the lives forever changed by the actions of one man, a ghost among the living. Christopher Lee Watts would eventually stand trial for the heinous crimes he had committed, his arrogance and his meticulous planning no longer enough to protect him from the consequences of his actions. The Watts family would be forever altered by the revelations, the weight of the truth bearing down on them like an unyielding storm. But for now, the townsfolk of Frederick would try to return to their lives, their blissful ignorance a distant memory, the haunting truth of Christopher Lee Watts' monstrous existence forever etched into their collective consciousness. The town of Frederick, Colorado, basked in the glow of summer, unaware of the dark underbelly that lurked within its seemingly tranquil streets. Christopher Lee Watts, a man who was known for his charming smile and seemingly impeccable home, was a ghost among the living, a predator that had turned his own home into a sanctuary of deceit and death. He was a master of manipulation, studying his victims like a painter studies his canvas, knowing precisely where to strike and when. His charm was a weapon, a mask that concealed the malevolent intentions behind his eyes. He'd become a local legend, the man who could fix anything, the handyman with a heart of gold. But behind the facade of kindness was a cunning mind that had honed its craft over years of study and practice. He'd learned the art of seduction, of using his charm to draw in his prey, and once they were within his grasp, he would reveal the true monster that lay hidden beneath the surface. His home, a picture-perfect house on the edge of town, was the perfect setting for his twisted games. Watts was meticulous in his preparation, ensuring that his victims never suspected a thing. He'd studied their routines, their schedules, their vulnerabilities, and he used that knowledge to his advantage. He'd prepare the perfect trap, a trap that was both beautiful and deadly, designed to ensnare his victims and then kill them in the most painful and sinister ways possible. The first few murders were carried out with a cold precision that left no room for error, and the bodies began to pile up like stones in a pile, each one a testament to Watts' increasing sadism. His family, blissfully unaware of the horror that unfolded beneath their very noses, dined on meals he'd prepared with his own hands. They spoke of him with reverence, praising his culinary skills and his endless generosity. The Watts family seemed to have everything. They were the embodiment of the American dream, living in a home that was a picture of perfection. But beneath that surface, a cancer of evil was spreading, feeding off the lifeblood of its victims. Watts was meticulous in his execution, leaving no trace of his crimes. He was a methodical killer, one who planned his attacks with the precision of a surgeon. He'd dispose of the bodies, making sure they were unrecognizable, and then he'd return to his life as if nothing had happened. The police, for their part, were baffled by the lack of evidence. They had no idea that a man was preying on their town, his victims never seen again after disappearing into the shadows. As the bodies mounted, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade. The townsfolk, once so blind to the danger that lurked among them, started to notice the missing people, the unexplained disappearances that were piling up like the bodies in Watts' secret killing ground. The weight of his actions threatened to tear the Watts family apart at the seams, the secrets they'd kept for so long now starting to bubble to the surface. But for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He was a man who had built his life on lies, a house of cards that was about to collapse, and as the pieces started to fall, Christopher Lee Watts realized that he was not the ghost among the living, but rather a ghost trapped in a world that was rapidly turning against him. The end was coming, and it was going to be far more brutal and tragic than he ever could have imagined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the Watts family compound, Christopher Lee Watts stood in the kitchen, a master chef with a deadly secret. He had spent hours perfecting his lies, weaving a web of deceit that seemed impenetrable. He had become a ghost among the living, a specter that haunted the dreams of his unsuspecting neighbors. Each night, as the family nestled into their beds, he would watch from the darkness, the silence his only companion, as he prepared the meals that would soon claim the lives of his closest kin. He had studied their habits, their routines, and their vulnerabilities, and he used his charm to draw them into his web. He was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his fingerprints as elusive as his victims' memories. But as the bodies began to pile up, so did the evidence, and the truth started to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, a silent assassin that would eventually tear the family apart at the seams. Yet, for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He had become a master of manipulation, a puppeteer controlling the strings of his family's lives, but the strings were beginning to snap, and the stringsman was about to face the consequences of his actions. As the weight of his crimes grew heavier, the silence around him seemed to echo with the cries of the souls he had claimed, a chorus of suffering that only he could hear. But even as the truth loomed, Christopher continued to play his role, a ghost among the living, his presence as insidious as the darkness that engulfed him each night. The silence was his ally, his shield, and for now he would continue to thrive in the shadows, his victims' cries a distant echo, a reminder of the darkness that he had brought into their lives. But the end was nigh, and the weight of his actions would soon be too much for the silence to bear, the truth poised to burst forth like a volcano about to erupt, shattering the facade of the Watts family and exposing the true horror that had been hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the Watts home, a beacon to those who knew the dark secrets hidden within its walls. Christopher Lee Watts, the seemingly kind and gentle family man, was in his element as he meticulously planned his next move. The murders had become an art form, each victim a canvas for his cold, calculating mind. He had grown fond of the thrill, the power, and the control it brought him. But as the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the scent of his lies began to permeate the very air of his sanctuary. His family, oblivious to the terror lurking within their own home, dined on meals he had prepared, savoring the warmth of a seemingly perfect life. His wife, his children, all believed they were safe in the arms of their loving husband and father. But beneath the surface, a web of deceit and darkness was unraveling, the threads of which were being woven into a tapestry of horror. Christopher was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his only mistake the arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet, for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. The townspeople were his audience, unknowingly complicit in his crimes, as they exchanged knowing glances and whispered secrets about the mysterious deaths that had begun to unsettle the once peaceful community. In the quiet of the night, Christopher would sit alone in his study, surrounded by the trophies of his crimes, the photographs, the mementos, the evidence of his power over the lives he had taken. He was a master of manipulation, a puppeteer pulling the strings of his unsuspecting victims. But as the police investigation grew closer, the strings began to fray, and the walls around his perfect facade started to crumble. The Watts family was the last to know. They were the last to be deceived, and when the truth finally broke through, it was like an explosion, shattering the illusion of their perfect life. The once close-knit family was torn apart by the revelations, each member grappling with their own shock and guilt. The children, the innocent bystanders, were forced to grow up too quickly, their childhood stolen by the hand of a monster. As the weight of the evidence bore down on Christopher, the townspeople were forced to confront the monster they had ignored, the darkness that had been living among them. The truth was ugly, brutal, and impossible to stomach, but it was the only way to confront the evil that had been lurking in the shadows. The police, once the silent guardians of the town, now stood as the vanguard, the protectors of the innocent, determined to bring Christopher to justice. In the end, Christopher Lee Watts would be unmasked, his reign of terror coming to an end. The town would be left to pick up the pieces, to heal from the scars of the monster that had lurked in their midst. The Watts family, forever shattered, would be forced to confront the reality of their loss, their lives forever altered by the evil that had been allowed to flourish in the shadows. And as the sun rose again, casting a new day upon the town, the people would look forward to a future free from the terror that had once lived among them, their trust in each other renewed and their resolve to protect their community stronger than ever before. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the Watts family home, Christopher Lee Watts, a man with a sinister smile, moved through the house with a practiced ease. Each step he took was deliberate, each breath he took was measured, and his eyes, though usually filled with a glint of warmth and kindness, now harbored a cold, calculating light. He had spent countless hours perfecting his act, blending into the fabric of everyday life while his victims were drawn to him like moths to a flame. He knew their routines, their vulnerabilities, and he used his charm to lure them into his trap, a trap that would end in their untimely deaths. His home, once a sanctuary of love and laughter, had become a killing ground, each room a stage for the performances that led to their downfall. He was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his only mistake the arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. The first to fall was his own wife, Shannon, a woman who had trusted him implicitly. He had studied her habits, her routines, and he knew exactly how to make her feel safe, secure, and loved. But love was a lie, a mask he wore to hide the darkness within. On that fateful night, as Shannon prepared for bed, Christopher slipped into the room, his hands trembling with the anticipation of the deed he was about to commit. He whispered sweet nothings, coaxed her into a false sense of security, and then, in a moment of silence, he struck. The sound of her scream echoed through the house, a sound that would never be heard again. Next came the turn of his young daughter, Celeste, a little girl with a smile that could light up the darkest corners of the universe. Christopher had watched her grow, had cherished the moments they shared, but all that was a facade. He had planned her death with the same precision as he had Shannon's. On a sunny afternoon, as Celeste played in the backyard, Christopher approached her with a smile, a gift in hand. But the gift was a trap, a poisoned apple that would end her life in a cruel twist of irony. Celeste's laughter turned to a gasp as the poison took effect, and her little body slumped to the ground, a silent plea for help that would go unheard. The next morning, as the Watts family dined on meals he had prepared, they were blissfully unaware of the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. They spoke of work, of friends, of dreams for the future, all the while, the weight of Christopher's actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. But for now, they remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, each piece fitting into the puzzle of Christopher's monstrous behavior. He had been meticulous, leaving no trace behind, but his arrogance had led him to make one critical error. He had believed that his family would never suspect him, that his perfect facade would hold. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, a truth that would shatter their perfect world and expose the monster that had been living among them. The townsfolk, for now, remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. They had no idea that the man they knew as a friendly neighbor, a devoted husband and father, was a killer, a monster who had been preying on them for years. They had no idea that the man they trusted was the one who had been taking their loved ones away, one by one, leaving behind a trail of death and destruction. But as the weight of his actions grew heavier, as the evidence mounted, the truth could no longer be hidden. The silence that had protected Christopher was starting to crack, and the weight of the truth was about to shatter the fragile facade of the Watts family home. The monster was about to be exposed, and the townsfolk, though they remained blissfully unaware for the time being, were about to learn the hard truth about the man they had once trusted. The silence was about to end, and the monster was about to pay for his crimes. But for now, the stage was set, and the final act was about to begin. Dipping into the shadows, Christopher Lee Watts emerged as a ghost among the living, a master manipulator who ensnared his victims with a spellbinding charm. He had meticulously studied their routines, their vulnerabilities, and exploited his allure to draw them into his treacherous trap. His home, once a sanctuary of warmth and love, had become a killing ground, each room a stage where the performances of his victims' lives would culminate in their untimely deaths. His family, blissfully unaware of the darkness that clung to him like a second skin, dined on meals he had prepared with a sinister precision, their laughter and chatter a stark contrast to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. Christopher was meticulous and methodical, leaving no trace of his evil deeds, his only flaw the arrogance that would ultimately be his downfall. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, each piece of it a puzzle that would eventually reveal the full extent of his heinous crimes. The truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He was a chameleon, blending in with the everyday life of his neighbors, his presence as imperceptible as a whisper in the wind. But his victims, they were not like the townsfolk, not at all. They were the ones who sought him out, drawn by a mix of loneliness, desperation, and the allure of the unknown. He played the part of the savior, offering them a reprieve from their troubles, only to deliver a fate far worse than any they could have imagined. The first victim had been a woman named Tessa, a single mother struggling to make ends meet. She had responded to an ad for a housekeeper on a local bulletin board, unaware of the horror that awaited her behind the closed doors of Watts' home. He had convinced her that she would find solace and companionship in his arms, but instead, she found herself a pawn in his twisted game of control and destruction. As the days turned into weeks, the number of victims grew, each one more tragic than the last. They were all different in their own way, but they shared a common thread. They trusted Christopher, and they were all lured to their deaths by the same irresistible force. He was a predator who had honed his skills to the point where he was almost impossible to detect, a ghost in the flesh. But ghosts are not without their flaws, and Christopher's arrogance was one of his most dangerous. He believed himself to be untouchable, invincible, and he made no effort to hide his true nature. He spoke openly about his victims, about the thrill of the hunt, about the satisfaction he derived from the pain he caused. He was a man who reveled in his power, a man who thought himself above the law. And then, one fateful night, the weight of his actions finally caught up with him. He had invited his wife, Robin, over for dinner, unaware that she had come to suspect something was amiss. The meal was a facade, a cover for the preparations he was making to dispose of yet another victim. But Robin's intuition was sharp, and she noticed the oddities, the way Christopher was acting, the way the house felt off. She confronted him, and in that confrontation, the walls of his carefully constructed life began to crumble. He tried to maintain his facade, to convince her that everything was fine, but the truth was too heavy to bear. And so, with the police on their way, Christopher Watts revealed his true self, a monster who had been living among the innocent, a man who had killed and killed again, and who was about to face the consequences of his monstrous behavior. The townsfolk awoke to the news, their blissful ignorance shattered, their lives forever changed. The Watts family was torn apart, the facade of their perfect life exposed for the lie it was. And Christopher, the ghost among the living, was finally cornered, his days of freedom over, and his reign of terror coming to an end. But the pain and the suffering he had caused would linger long after his imprisonment, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can exist even in the most unsuspecting places. In the quiet hamlet of Cripple Creek, Colorado, Christopher Lee Watts, a seemingly ordinary man with a penchant for the dark arts, had woven a tapestry of deceit and horror that would shatter the lives of those closest to him. As the days turned into weeks, Watts' victims, each one an unsuspecting soul, were drawn to him like moths to a flame. He'd studied their routines, their vulnerabilities, and he used his charm to lure them into his trap. His home, a sanctuary of deceit, became a killing ground, each room a stage for the performances that led to their untimely deaths. His family, blissfully unaware, dined on meals he'd prepared, oblivious to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. Watts was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his only mistake the arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet, for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He was a ghost among the living, a man who could walk in broad daylight without raising an eyebrow, his secrets buried so deep that even those closest to him could not fathom the horror that lay beneath the surface. His victims, from the young and the old, were all entangled in his web of lies, their lives snuffed out by a man who believed he was beyond the reach of justice. But as the evidence mounted, and the police began to unravel the threads of his carefully constructed web, Christopher Watts found himself cornered, the silence that had once shielded him now turning into a suffocating trap. The townsfolk, once complacent, began to whisper behind closed doors, their fear of the unknown gnawing at their insides. The once idyllic community was now a breeding ground for suspicion and dread, as the weight of the truth bore down upon them like a heavy, ominous cloud. Watts, once a pillar of the community, was now a pariah, his every move scrutinized by those who had once looked up to him. But even as the truth unraveled, Watts remained unfazed, his confidence in his ability to evade capture unwavering. He was a master of manipulation, a con artist who had fooled everyone, including himself. As the police closed in, Watts' mind raced with thoughts of escape, of how to throw them off the scent, of how to ensure that his secrets remained buried forever. But as the evidence mounted, and the police began to piece together the puzzle, Watts found himself at the mercy of a justice system that had been waiting for him all along. The townsfolk, once blissfully unaware, now watched in horror as the man they had once admired was unmasked, his true nature exposed for all to see. The facade of the Watts family, once a beacon of normalcy, now crumbled into dust, leaving behind a void that could never be filled. And as the truth came to light, the once serene town of Cripple Creek was forever changed, its residents left to grapple with the horror that had been lurking in their midst all along. Christopher Lee Watts, the ghost among the living, had left an indelible mark on the community, a mark that would take generations to erase. The story of the Watts family murders would become a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in the most seemingly perfect of lives, darkness can hide in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the eerie quiet of the Watts estate, Christopher Lee Watts was a master of illusion, his every move calculated to maintain the facade of a normal family man. The sun would set, and the shadows would stretch across the lawn, a canvas upon which he painted his macabre masterpiece. He'd watch from his study window as his unsuspecting family made their way home, the children's laughter mingling with the hum of evening insects, a false harmony that masked the darkness within. As they entered the house, the warmth of the hearth would greet them, a comforting illusion of domestic bliss. But in the kitchen, where he stood with a knife in hand, the illusion was shattered as he meticulously prepared the meal that would soon be their last. He'd chosen his victims carefully, those who seemed most vulnerable, most in need of a savior, and he dangled the carrot of love and companionship before them, a mirage that drew them ever closer to the abyss. His home was a sanctuary of deceit, a place where secrets were whispered and lies were spun with the same ease as a bedtime story. He'd even taken to writing letters to his victims, a twisted form of seduction that left them feeling cherished and desired, never suspecting the true nature of the man they were falling for. As the years passed, the bodies began to pile up, each one more carefully concealed than the last. He'd dig his own graves, ensuring that no one would ever find the truth hidden beneath the earth. But as the ground beneath his feet grew colder, so too did the cracks in the facade he had so meticulously maintained. The police had started to take notice, their inquiries leading them closer to the heart of the darkness that had taken root in the community. Yet, Christopher remained undeterred, his arrogance fueling a belief that he was untouchable, that his perfect crime would never be unraveled. The evidence began to mount, each piece fitting together like a puzzle that was slowly revealing the true picture of the Watts family. The townsfolk, who had once looked upon the Watts with envy and admiration, now whispered behind closed doors, their suspicion growing with each passing day. The weight of his actions began to take its toll on his family, the children feeling the strain of their father's peculiar behavior, the wife growing more distant as the secrets he kept from her mounted. But for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. The police were relentless, their determination fueled by the knowledge that they were on the brink of uncovering a horror that would shock the world. The Watts family, blissfully unaware, dined on meals he'd prepared, oblivious to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. Yet the clock was ticking, and the truth could no longer be contained, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. The silence was about to shatter, and the truth would emerge, a truth that would change everything. In the quiet town of Arvada, Colorado, Christopher Lee Watts was a man shrouded in mystery, his presence as enigmatic as the shadows that seemed to follow him wherever he went. His victims, young and naive, were drawn to him like moths to a flame, captivated by his charm and the promise of a better life. He had honed his skills as a manipulator, studying their routines, their vulnerabilities, and using his natural charm to weave a web of deceit that was almost impossible to escape. His home, a seemingly idyllic sanctuary, was a mask for the darkness that lurked within, each room a stage for the performances that would lead to their untimely deaths. The kitchen, where he cooked the meals his family dined on every evening, was the epicenter of his lies, the smell of his culinary creations masking the stench of his crimes. Watts was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace behind, his only mistake the arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. His wife, Susan, and their two young daughters, Sam and Celeste, were blissfully unaware of the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. Susan, a woman who had once been so vibrant and full of life, now walked through the house with a veil of sorrow cast over her eyes, her laughter a mere echo of the woman she once was. Sam, the eldest, had grown distant, her eyes reflecting the pain she felt but couldn't articulate, while Celeste, the youngest, was a bundle of nerves, her questions about her missing friends and the strange occurrences at home going unanswered. The townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He had become the embodiment of the perfect neighbor, the man who volunteered at the community center, the father who coached his daughter's soccer team, and the husband who doted on his wife. But beneath this mask of respectability, a monster was born, one that would not be contained for much longer. The police, who had been tipped off by a concerned neighbor, were closing in, their investigation piecing together the puzzle of Watts' macabre past, each clue bringing them closer to the heart of the darkness that had taken root in their community. As the evidence mounted, the cracks in the Watts facade became more pronounced, and the silence that had once protected him was now a burden, a weight that seemed to suffocate him. He was not a man who could bear the pressure of his secrets, and as the truth began to leak out, he lashed out, trying to destroy any evidence that could incriminate him. But it was too late. The truth was out there, and it was only a matter of time before it caught up with him. The townsfolk, who had once seen him as a pillar of the community, now whispered about him in hushed tones, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. The Watts home, once a beacon of normalcy, was now a place of dread, a haunting reminder of the monster that had been living among them. The weight of his actions was overwhelming, and Christopher Lee Watts knew that his time was running out. He had played his game too well, had hidden his secrets too deeply, and now the walls were closing in. The police were on his tail, the evidence was overwhelming, and the truth was impossible to deny. He had built his empire on lies, and now that empire was crumbling, leaving behind a trail of destruction that would haunt him for the rest of his days. As the inevitable truth closed in on him, Christopher Lee Watts found himself at the precipice of a fall, his life unraveling before his eyes, and the weight of his crimes becoming too heavy to bear. In the eerie quiet of the small town of Wheat Ridge, Colorado, Christopher Lee Watts lived a life that was a tapestry of lies and a canvas of horror. He was a man who wore the mask of a perfect family man, but behind that facade was a monster whose heart was as dark as the shadows into which he disappeared. He had honed his skills as a predator, studying his victims with a calculating mind, understanding their habits, their secrets, and their deepest fears. With a charm that could make the coldest heart melt, he lured them into his web, each encounter a dance with death. Watts' home was a sanctuary of deceit, a place where the sweet aroma of dinner prepared by his own hands masked the stench of death. His family, blissfully unaware, dined on meals he'd meticulously cooked, never suspecting that the man who served them was also the one who would end their lives. He was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his fingerprints as clean as his conscience was black. He was a master of manipulation, using his charm and charisma to gain the trust of his victims, and then, without a moment's hesitation, he would end their lives with a knife or a rope, leaving behind no witnesses, no evidence, just the cold, empty silence of a crime scene. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade. The weight of his actions threatened to tear the family apart at the seams, but for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He was a ghost among the living, a man who had become a legend in his own mind, untouchable and uncatchable, until the day when the weight of his crimes became too heavy to bear, and the veil of silence was finally pierced by the relentless pursuit of justice. The police investigation was a labyrinth, a maze of clues and dead ends, but it was the relentless determination of Detective Dave Olinger that would eventually lead to Watts' downfall. He had seen the signs, the small pieces of the puzzle that hinted at a much larger picture, and he was determined to uncover the truth. As he pieced together the evidence, the picture of Watts' monstrous behavior became clearer, and the townsfolk were forced to confront the horror that had been hidden in plain sight. The arrest of Christopher Watts sent shockwaves through the community, and as the details of his crimes were revealed, the townsfolk were left reeling. The man they had known as a pillar of the community, a loving husband and father, was now a monster, a man who had systematically destroyed the lives of his victims and his own family. The Watts family, once a beacon of normalcy, was now a symbol of the darkest corners of human nature, and the weight of their loss was felt by all who knew them. The trial was a spectacle, a courtroom drama that captivated the nation. Christopher Watts stood trial for the murders of his pregnant wife, Samantha, and her two young daughters, Bella and Celeste. As the evidence was presented, the true extent of his crimes became shockingly clear, and the courtroom was filled with the sound of sobs and whispers of disbelief. Watts, with his calm demeanor and cold eyes, seemed almost indifferent to the horror he had wrought, but the jury saw through his facade, and they found him guilty of multiple counts of first-degree murder. The sentencing was a moment of justice, a moment when the weight of Watts' actions was finally acknowledged and confronted. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a fate that seemed fitting for a man who had taken so many lives. As he was led away in shackles, the townsfolk watched in horror, their world forever changed by the presence of the man who had been among them, a ghost among the living, a monster who had walked among them in plain sight. The aftermath of Watts' crimes left a scar on the town of Wheat Ridge, a scar that would take generations to heal. The families of his victims sought solace in each other, finding strength in their shared pain, while the townsfolk grappled with the realization that the man they had trusted was a monster, a man whose actions had shattered their sense of safety and security. The story of Christopher Lee Watts would be a cautionary tale, a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who walk among us, hidden in plain sight, and that the line between good and evil is not always as clear as we would like to believe. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the Watts family's picturesque suburban home, Christopher Lee Watts stood in the kitchen, his hands trembling slightly as he mixed a new batch of his favorite poison. He had been meticulous in his planning, but tonight, he felt a strange sense of urgency, as if the walls were closing in around him. The murders had been going on for months, and with each passing day, the evidence stacked against him grew more substantial. The police were closing in, and Christopher knew that his time was running out. He had chosen his first victim, his neighbor and close friend, because she had shown a genuine interest in him. He had taken her out to dinner, flattered her with compliments, and then lured her back to his home under the guise of a private celebration. Once inside, he had incapacitated her with chloroform, then calmly strangled her with his bare hands, making sure to cover her face with a pillow to avoid the risk of witnesses hearing her cries. He had buried her in a shallow grave in the woods behind his house, her body now just a distant memory among the countless fallen leaves. His second victim had been a young woman he met at the gym. She had been intrigued by his stories of adventure, and Christopher had taken full advantage of her curiosity. He had invited her over for a workout, but instead he had drugged her, tied her up, and raped her in the darkest corner of his basement. When she had regained consciousness, he had calmly explained that it was a misunderstanding and left her with a few $100s to keep her quiet. But she had not been so easily dissuaded, and soon the police were knocking on his door, demanding answers to questions he could not provide. By then, Christopher had learned to be more careful. He had moved on to women he met online, luring them with false promises of romance and a perfect life. He had taken the time to research their backgrounds, their routines, and their vulnerabilities. He had even gone so far as to create a fake profile on a dating site, using a picture of a charming man with a seemingly perfect life. But as he continued his deadly game, the evidence began to pile up, and the police were now closing in on him like a pack of hungry wolves. His family, however, remained blissfully unaware of the evil that dwelled in their midst. They dined on meals he had prepared, their laughter echoing through the house as they shared stories of their daily lives. His wife, Robin, had no idea that the man she loved was a monster, a man who had taken the lives of two innocent women and left behind a trail of destruction that was about to unravel their perfect life. His children, unaware of the darkness that lived within their father, played in the yard, their innocence a stark contrast to the horror that had taken root in their home. Christopher had been meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, but as the bodies piled up, so did the evidence. The police had begun to piece together the puzzle, connecting the dots that would lead them to his doorstep. They had discovered the shallow grave in the woods, the DNA evidence that matched the first victim, and the trail of destruction that had been left behind. The truth was seeping through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He had built his empire on lies, and now, as the walls closed in, he found himself trapped in a web of his own making, his every move being scrutinized by the law enforcement agents who were determined to bring him to justice. The night grew colder as Christopher stood in the kitchen, his heart pounding in his chest, the taste of fear mingling with the bitter aftertaste of his own deception. He knew that his time was running out, that the truth would soon burst forth like a volcano, obliterating everything he had built. But for now, he clung to the illusion of control, the belief that he could escape the darkness that was fast becoming his undoing. But as the shadows grew longer, and the weight of his crimes bore down on him, Christopher Lee Watts realized that there was no escaping the truth, no hiding from the monster that had been created from the fabric of his own lies. The townsfolk of Brawley, California, had always regarded Christopher Lee Watts with a mixture of awe and affection, viewing him as a doting husband and father, a pillar of the community, a man whose quiet charm and seemingly genuine kindness were the stuff of local legend. Little did they know, behind the facade of the Watts' idyllic home, a sinister web of deceit and horror was being woven, a tapestry of tragedy that would shock the very core of their peaceful little town. Watts had become a master of manipulation, his charismatic demeanor a tool of his trade, as he meticulously planned and executed his chilling crimes, leaving no trace behind but the cold, empty shells of his victims. As the months rolled by, Watts' grip on his family and his unsuspecting neighbors tightened, his actions becoming ever more brazen and calculating. He'd become a master of the art of disappearance, erasing any evidence of his victims, leaving behind only a few cryptic clues that would, years later, serve as the foundation for unraveling the harrowing truth. The family's social calendar was a mask for his sinister activities, with picnics and barbecues becoming the perfect cover for his nocturnal excursions into the darkness, where he would ensnare his next unsuspecting prey. Watts' victims, drawn to him by his charming smiles and persuasive words, had no idea they were stepping into a trap that would lead to their doom. They were the unsuspecting victims of his twisted game, and their lives were claimed one by one as Watts' addiction to power and control grew. The police, too, remained blissfully unaware, their inquiries into missing persons cases often leading them down dead ends, only to leave the families of the victims with a hollow sense of loss and the lingering suspicion that the truth was far more sinister than they could ever imagine. The Watts family home, a picturesque sanctuary of domestic bliss, was in fact a breeding ground for his malevolent desires. His wife, Carol, and his children seemed oblivious to the darkness that seeped through the walls, content to live out their lives in the illusion of normalcy. Carol, in particular, was a woman of strong personality and unwavering loyalty, her blind faith in her husband allowing him to manipulate her and the children into a state of complacency. They dined on meals he'd prepared, oblivious to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. As Watts' crimes escalated, the evidence began to accumulate, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. The police, now aware of the case, began to piece together the puzzle, each new clue leading them closer to the grim reality that lay hidden in plain sight. The townsfolk, who had once regarded Watts with such reverence, now began to whisper among themselves, their once blind trust replaced by a creeping sense of dread. Yet, for now, the veil of silence that had protected Christopher from the inevitable truth remained intact. The townsfolk clung to their blissful ignorance, a collective denial that shielded them from the horrors that were about to unfold. Watts, however, was becoming increasingly brazen, his arrogance feeding his delusion that he could evade justice forever. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to close in on him like a vengeful shadow, an ever-present reminder of the dark side of the man they had once revered. But in the end, no matter how meticulously Watts had planned his crimes, no matter how deep the well of deception he had dug for himself and his family, the inevitable truth was closing in. The cracks in the facade were growing wider, the silence that had protected him was beginning to crack, and the shadow that had been following him was now casting its long, ominous reach over the town of Brawley, California, as the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, setting the stage for the dramatic and chilling revelations that were to come. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, ominous shadows across the Watts suburban sanctuary. Christopher Lee Watts, a ghost among the living, watched from behind the veil of his own creation, his eyes like cold, calculating machines. His victims, unaware of the danger they faced, were drawn to him like moths to a flame, captivated by his charm and allure. He had studied their routines, their vulnerabilities, and he used his charismatic facade to lure them into his trap. Each person he ensnared was a puzzle to solve, a challenge to overcome, and he thrived on the thrill of the hunt. Inside his home, a sanctuary of deceit, Christopher's hands worked tirelessly. He cooked, cleaned, and maintained an impeccable appearance, ensuring that no hint of his sinister intentions ever peeked through. His family, blissfully unaware of the horror that unfolded beneath the surface, dined on meals he'd prepared with meticulous care, oblivious to the macabre truth that lay hidden in their seemingly perfect life. They believed they had the perfect family, a happy home where love and laughter reigned supreme, and Christopher played his role to the hilt, never giving away his true nature. The bodies began to pile up, each one more meticulously concealed than the last. Christopher was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace behind. His only mistake was the arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. As the evidence mounted, so did the threats to his perfect facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the Watts family apart at the seams. But for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. The nights grew longer, the silence louder, and Christopher's heart raced with the anticipation of the next conquest. He needed to be careful, though. The more people he killed, the more likely it was that someone would notice something amiss. His mind raced with paranoia, and he was always on the lookout for any sign of detection. The pressure mounted, and the walls began to crumble around him. Then, it happened. A routine check-in call turned into a nightmare as the person on the other end of the line sensed something was off. The fear in their voice, the hesitancy in their words, all set off alarms in Christopher's mind. He knew he had to act fast, and he knew he had to be ruthless. As the authorities closed in, he made his final preparations, his mind racing with a cocktail of fear and determination. The police arrived just as Christopher was packing his car, the evidence against him as clear as day. He was caught red-handed, and the truth was unavoidable. As the townsfolk learned of the Watts' dark secret, the facade crumbled, and the once perfect family became synonymous with horror. Christopher's arrogance had been his downfall, and the justice system would mete out its own brand of retribution, ensuring that his reign of terror would come to an end. In the quiet of the small town, Christopher Lee Watts lived a life that was as deceptive as it was sinister. He was a man of many faces, a chameleon among men, and his victims were drawn to him like moths to a flame. His charm was a weapon, a tool he wielded with ruthless precision, using it to lure unsuspecting souls into his trap. He studied their routines, their vulnerabilities, and he knew exactly how to manipulate them. His home, a sanctuary of deceit, became a killing ground, each room a stage for the performances that led to their untimely deaths. The kitchen, where he'd prepare the meals that would be the last thing his victims ever tasted, was a place of both warmth and horror. The living room, where laughter and conversation once filled the air, now echoed with the cries of the innocent. The bedrooms, once havens of rest, were now tombs, their walls stained with the blood of the departed. His family, blissfully unaware, dined on meals he'd prepared, oblivious to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. They were like puppets on strings, their strings held by the hand of a master manipulator who knew exactly how to pull them. Christopher was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace. He was a master of disguise, a con artist who could turn a room into a crime scene without leaving a single clue. His only mistake was the arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet, for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He was a ghost among the living, a specter that haunted the dreams of those who knew him, and the townsfolk were like sheep led to the slaughter, none the wiser to the danger lurking in their midst. But as the evidence mounted, and the whispers of suspicion began to ripple through the community, the silence would soon be broken, and the truth would emerge, shattering the fragile facade of the Watts family and exposing the monster that had been living among them all along. In the eerie silence of the small town, Christopher Lee Watts lived his double life, a master of deception, his every move calculated and cold. He'd chosen his victims carefully, those who were most vulnerable, those who sought solace in the warmth of his smile and the promise of a better life. He'd studied them, their fears, their secrets, and he'd exploited them with a precision that left no room for error. He was a chameleon, blending seamlessly into the community, his home a sanctuary of tranquility that belied the horror within. Each night, as the family gathered for dinner, they were blissfully unaware of the darkness that clung to their lives like a second skin. The meals he prepared were exquisite, the ambience perfect, and his stories captivating, kept everyone ensconced in his web. His children, innocent and trusting, knew no better, their laughter echoing through the halls, a stark contrast to the macabre acts that unfolded within the confines of their home. Christopher was meticulous, methodical, leaving no trace behind, his fingerprints and DNA never found at the scenes of his crimes. He was a master of disguise, a chameleon that could shed one identity and don another with ease, his only constant the twisted satisfaction he derived from his victims' suffering. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, bits and pieces of the truth scattered like confetti at a funeral, each piece a testament to his malevolence. The town remained blissfully unaware, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the prying eyes of law enforcement. Yet, as the bodies mounted, the evidence accumulated, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade. The weight of his actions threatened to tear the family apart at the seams. The police, though slow to act, were relentless in their pursuit, their instincts honed by years of chasing criminals. They knew something was amiss, that the Watts family lived a lie, and they were determined to uncover the truth. The townsfolk, who had once regarded Christopher as the kindest, most generous man in town, now whispered behind closed doors, their voices a chorus of suspicion and fear. They watched, they waited, and they prayed that the truth would not unravel the fabric of their lives. Yet for now, the veil of silence remained, a shield that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow, a truth that would change everything, a truth that would tear apart the very foundation of their world. In the quiet hamlet of Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, Christopher Lee Watts was a figure cloaked in mystery, a ghost among the living, and his victims were drawn to him like moths to a flame. He had honed his craft over the years, studying their routines, their vulnerabilities, and using his charm to lure them into his trap. His home, a sanctuary of deceit, became a killing ground, each room a stage for the performances that led to their untimely deaths. His family, blissfully unaware, dined on meals he'd prepared, oblivious to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. Watts was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his only mistake the arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet, for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He was a master of manipulation, a con artist with a twisted agenda, and he had become so consumed by his dark desires that he couldn't see the world outside his carefully constructed web. He had become a predator, preying on the innocence of those who trusted him, and as the townsfolk went about their daily lives, they were none the wiser to the horror that unfolded behind closed doors. Watts had become so adept at covering his tracks that even the most seasoned detectives struggled to piece together the puzzle of his crimes. But as the years passed, the pieces began to fit together, and the truth about the Watts family murders started to emerge from the shadows. It was a story of deceit, of betrayal, and of a man who had lost touch with the very essence of humanity. The townsfolk were shocked, their trust in their neighbors shattered, and they found themselves grappling with the reality that the monster they had never suspected could be lurking in their midst. As the investigation deepened, the evidence mounted, and the chilling details of Watts' crimes came to light, the community was left reeling from the revelations. The once idyllic town was now a place of fear and suspicion, and the Watts family name became synonymous with horror and tragedy. But even as the truth unfolded, Christopher Lee Watts remained a ghost among the living, his arrogance and delusions keeping him from facing the consequences of his actions. He was a man who had fallen into the abyss of his own making, and as the world around him crumbled, he clung to the illusion that he could escape the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. But the weight of his crimes was too great to bear, and the day would come when the monster would be exposed, and the truth would no longer be hidden in the shadows. The Watts family murders were a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist within the human soul, and the chilling legacy of Christopher Lee Watts would be a cautionary tale for generations to come. In the quiet hamlet of Cripple Creek, Colorado, Christopher Lee Watts lived a life that was a twisted tapestry of normalcy and darkness. As the days turned into weeks, his insatiable appetite for destruction grew, and with it, the number of lives he claimed. He was a ghost among the living, a master of manipulation and deceit, and his victims were drawn to him like moths to a flame, lured by the promise of love and companionship. He studied their routines, their vulnerabilities, and he used his charm to lure them into his trap, his words like a siren's call that promised salvation but delivered a fatal embrace. His home, a sanctuary of deceit, became a killing ground, each room a stage for the performances that led to their untimely deaths. He was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his only mistake the arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet, for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. The family, blissfully unaware, dined on meals he'd prepared, oblivious to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. They were blissfully in the dark, as if they were part of a grand illusion, and Christopher, the master of illusion, reveled in their innocence. He was the puppeteer and they were the puppets, dancing to his tune, blissfully unaware of the strings he pulled and the strings he would soon snap. As the bodies of his victims accumulated in the crawl space beneath his home, Christopher's mind became a labyrinth of twisted logic, justifying each act as a necessary evil, a means to an end he believed to be justified. But as the walls of his facade crumbled, so did the illusion of his perfect family, the facade of normalcy that had been his shield against detection. His wife, Sarah, was the first to sense something amiss, the first to question the man she had known for years. Her instincts, honed by the years of living in a home where the air was thick with the scent of fear, told her that something was very wrong. But Christopher, ever the manipulator, was quick to reassure her, to tell her that her concerns were unfounded, that the whispers of his neighbors were merely the prattle of the idle and the envious. But the whispers grew louder and the shadows grew longer, and soon the town of Cripple Creek would learn the truth that Christopher Lee Watts was not a man among men but a monster among men, a ghost among the living, whose laughter was the sound of death, whose touch was the kiss of the grave. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the Watts estate, Christopher Lee Watts stood in the center of his kitchen, a master chef with a dark secret. He had always been the perfect husband, the doting father, the charming neighbor, but beneath the surface, his heart was a churning cauldron of malice and control. He had meticulously planned each murder, ensuring that no one would ever suspect the truth. The first time he strangled his wife, it had been an act of passion, he told himself, but soon the thrill of power and the satisfaction of control became his driving force. He had learned from his mistakes, becoming more cunning with each victim, and as the bodies accumulated, so did the pieces of evidence that would one day bring him down. His children, young and impressionable, had grown up surrounded by the scent of freshly baked bread and the warmth of a seemingly idyllic family life. They knew nothing of the late-night phone calls to his victims, the carefully orchestrated meetings, or the cold, calculating planning that went into each execution. The family dog, a loyal golden retriever named Max, had always been a silent witness to the comings and goings, but even he remained oblivious to the horror that unfolded within the walls of their home. Christopher had been meticulous in his deception, leaving no trace of the violence that had become his way of life. He had even managed to dispose of the bodies in such a way that they were never found, leaving no trace behind except for the occasional fishhook or a piece of bone that washed up on the beach. As the years passed, the Watts family continued to thrive, their reputation in the community a testament to Christopher's supposed goodness. He was a member of the local church, a volunteer at the community center, and a coach for the local soccer team. He was well-liked, respected, and above all, trusted. But even as he moved from one victim to the next, the evidence began to pile up, hidden away in the minds of those who had seen him in his true form. His victims had been friends, neighbors, colleagues, and even a few members of his own family, all drawn to him like moths to a flame, unaware of the darkness that consumed him. The townsfolk remained blissfully unaware of the sinister undercurrents that ran through their community, their silence a veil that protected Christopher from the truth. He had become so adept at covering his tracks that even when the police began to investigate the disappearances, they found no solid evidence to connect him to the crimes. But as the bodies continued to pile up, so did the questions and the pressure began to build. The cracks in the Watts facade were starting to show, and the weight of his actions was threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Christopher felt the familiar dread settle in his chest. He had been caught, he knew it, and the weight of his transgressions was about to catch up with him. The silence of the room was oppressive, the clinking of silverware against porcelain, a stark reminder of the lives he had taken. He had always been a master of manipulation, but now, as the walls closed in around him, he realized that his arrogance had been his undoing. The truth was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow, and there was nowhere left to hide. Ding into the shadows, a ghost among the living, and his victims were drawn to him like moths to a flame. He'd studied their routines, their vulnerabilities, and he used his charm to lure them into his trap. His home, a sanctuary of deceit, became a killing ground, each room a stage for the performances that led to their untimely deaths. The master bedroom, where he'd whispered sweet nothings to unsuspecting women, was now a scene of horror, the sheets stained with the innocent blood of his prey. The dining room, once filled with laughter and warmth, had become a chilling testament to his sinister nature, the tables groaning under the weight of the silence that had settled over the place. The children's playroom, with its colorful toys and cheerful artwork, had been transformed into a place of mourning, the laughter replaced by the hollow echo of a mother's despair. His family, blissfully unaware, dined on meals he'd prepared, oblivious to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. They spoke of work and school, of friends and hobbies, all the while never suspecting that their husband and father was a monster in human form. The children, with their bright eyes and endless curiosity, never questioned the eerie absence of some of their playmates, their questions brushed aside with casual dismissals or vague explanations that never quite satisfied the gnawing unease that seemed to taint the very air they breathed. Christopher was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his only mistake the arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. He believed himself to be a master of deception, a manipulator of souls, and he reveled in the power he held over his victims. Yet, as the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade. His fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, his DNA was in the blood of his victims, and the inconsistencies in his stories grew more and more apparent as the police investigation delved deeper. The townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. They were too afraid to speak up, too comfortable in their denial, too willing to turn a blind eye to the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of their peaceful community. But the weight of his actions threatened to tear the family apart at the seams. His wife, once a beacon of strength and support, now found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about the man she had once loved. The children, who had never known their true father, were forced to confront the terrifying reality of their parentage, their innocence shattered by the knowledge that they had been living a lie. As the investigation progressed, the townsfolk began to stir, whispers of suspicion and fear beginning to ripple through the community. But it was too late. The truth had been revealed, and the once perfect Watts family was now synonymous with horror and tragedy. The media swarmed the town, their relentless inquiries and insatiable curiosity only fueling the flames of public outrage. Christopher, once a revered member of the community, was now a pariah, his name a byword for evil and madness. The trial was a spectacle, the courtroom filled with spectators and reporters, all eager to witness the dismantling of the man who had so brazenly violated the sanctity of life. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies harrowing, and the verdict was swift and just. Christopher Lee Watts was sentenced to life in prison without parole, his final act of defiance a pitiful attempt to cling to the remnants of his humanity. Yet, even as he was led away to his cell, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and sorrow, Christopher Watts could not escape the knowledge that his family, his once perfect facade, had been destroyed beyond repair. The silence that had once protected him was now a heavy shroud of guilt and remorse, and as he vanished down the dark corridor, the weight of his sins was a burden that would never be lifted. The townsfolk, once in their blissful ignorance, were now forever changed, their lives forever altered by the revelations that had shattered the fabric of their community. The story of Christopher Lee Watts and the Watts family murders would forever be etched in their collective memory, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist even in the most unsuspecting of places. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the Watts' sprawling estate, Christopher Lee Watts reveled in the quiet that enveloped his domain. The house, once a beacon of warmth and happiness, now felt like a mausoleum, each room a chamber of secrets and sorrow. His victims, a tapestry of souls, had been woven into the fabric of his existence, their lives a tapestry of threads that he had meticulously cut, leaving behind a tapestry of lies. He had become a master of manipulation, a con artist of the darkest kind, whose charm was as deadly as his intent. In the kitchen, where the aroma of freshly cooked meals lingered, he would prepare the final act of his performance, the one that would seal the fate of his latest target. The kitchen was a stage, and he was the director, orchestrating the final act with precision and care. He knew the exact moment when his prey would step into the trap, their eyes wide with curiosity, their minds racing with anticipation. It was a dance, a deadly waltz, and he was the one who held the lead, guiding them into the abyss. His family, blissfully unaware of the horror that unfolded behind closed doors, dined on the meals he had prepared with his own hands. They laughed, they argued, they shared stories, and in that moment they were as blind to the truth as the rest of the town. The facade of normalcy was so convincing that even those who suspected something was amiss could not see the monster lurking within their midst. Christopher was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace. He had studied forensic science, learning how to dispose of bodies without leaving a single clue. His only mistake was the arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. He believed himself to be untouchable, invincible, and that belief was his undoing. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, each one a piece of a puzzle that was slowly coming together. The truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet, for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He had become a ghost among the living, a man who walked the earth with the souls of his victims whispering in his ears. He was a man who had killed for sport, who had taken pleasure in the suffering of others, and who had hidden his monstrous nature beneath a mask of normalcy. But as the evidence mounted, the silence that had protected him was beginning to crack, and the truth was on the brink of bursting forth, ready to shatter the illusion of the perfect Watts family and expose the monster that had been living among them all along. In the quiet hamlet of Cripple Creek, Colorado, Christopher Lee Watts was a man of many faces, a chameleon of deception who slithered into the shadows, a ghost among the living, and his victims were drawn to him like moths to a flame. He'd studied their routines, their vulnerabilities, and he used his charm to lure them into his trap. His home, a sanctuary of deceit, became a killing ground, each room a stage for the performances that led to their untimely deaths. The living room, with its plush sofas and cozy ambience, was where he'd host casual get-togethers, a front for the sinister reality that unfolded behind closed doors. The kitchen, a place of warmth and sustenance, was where he'd prepare the meals that would be his victims' last. The bedrooms, with their soft lighting and comforting scents, were where he'd claim their lives, each room a mausoleum for the souls he'd claimed. His family, blissfully unaware, dined on meals he'd prepared, oblivious to the macabre truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. He was meticulous, methodical, and always left no trace, his only mistake the arrogance that would eventually catch up with him. As the bodies piled up, so did the evidence, and the truth began to seep through the cracks in the Watts facade, the weight of his actions threatening to tear the family apart at the seams. Yet, for now, the townsfolk remained in their blissful ignorance, a veil of silence that protected Christopher from the inevitable truth that was closing in on him like a vengeful shadow. He was a master of manipulation, a predator who thrived on the trust of his community, and he was meticulous in ensuring that no one would ever suspect the darkness that lay within him. He'd chosen his victims carefully, selecting those who were most vulnerable, those who were most susceptible to his charm and manipulation. He'd preyed on the lonely, the vulnerable, and the desperate, using their own vulnerabilities against them. He'd tell them stories of love and loss, of dreams and aspirations, weaving a web of lies that was both captivating and deadly. He'd listen to their confessions, their secrets, and he'd use that information to tighten his grip on them, ensuring that they were never able to escape his grasp. He was a con artist, a manipulator, and a murderer, and he was also a master of disguise, able to blend into the fabric of society without ever raising an eyebrow. He'd chosen his first victim, a young woman named Samantha, because she was alone and vulnerable, a single mother who had been through more heartache than most could bear. He'd approached her at a local diner, offering her a kind word and a listening ear, and she'd been all too eager to accept his offer of companionship. He'd taken her to his home, a place that seemed warm and inviting, and he'd introduced her to his family, a seemingly perfect unit that she had always envied. He'd told her stories of his own struggles, of his own pain, and she'd listened, her heart softened by his tales of woe. But beneath the surface, Christopher was a snake, a creature that would strike without warning, and he struck that night, his actions as brutal as they were calculated. Samantha had never seen it coming, never realized that the man she had trusted with her life was nothing more than a predator waiting for his next meal. As the years passed, Christopher continued his reign of terror, his victims piling up.